Good evening and Assalamu alaikum. Welcome from Thinkfest, Pakistan, for our summer Thinkfest conversation series in the summer of 2021. Today, we are extremely delighted and honored, actually, that we are hosting this very wonderful book launch panel today. And we have got two excellent speakers for it. And I'm privileged to be able to at least introduce them and say a couple of words about them. Of course, all of us kind of know them and love them. So therefore, I won't do a long introduction because that will take about half an hour, at least for Navid Shahzad, if nothing else. So इसलिए मैं ज़रा इसको बहुत लंबा नहीं करूँगा. But we are actually honored, and I think Omar will agree that it is amazing that someone of the caliber of Navid Shahzad is actually going to be in conversation with him today. She's an artist, an educationist. She's worked on several philanthropy boards. She's been dean at PNU. She has worked with Lahore Grammar School. She has acted in wonderful plays and TV serials and all those other kinds of things. So, you know, it's a lifelong career of educating us, a lot of the times entertaining us also. But most importantly, and I think from the Thinkfest perspective, making us think. I can still look back on a number of her TV shows where, you know, at the end of it, you are really forced to think about the issues that she as an actress has brought to the fore. So we are very grateful and thankful that she's taken time out this Sunday evening to speak to us today on Omar Shahid Hamid's wonderful new novel, which I just very shamefully admitted is the first novel I am reading in 2021, but I'm very happy that it's Omar's novel. Omar, of course, as we all know, is an accomplished Pakistani novelist. But with that, he is also a serving police officer of Pakistan. So if no one knew that, you know, that's perhaps one of the links through which kind of runs through a lot of his writing. And that informs his real grip on real life issues and into the personalities of people. He has worked in counterterrorism, he has worked in normal policing and all these other places, and that gives him a very particular and also a very peculiar look at the lives of people around him, the people he is serving with, the people he is serving, and lots of societal issues. So we are very happy, Omar, that we are launching your book here. Before handing it over to Ms. Shahzad, I must also thank Amina Sayyed of Lightstone Books, who has actually published this book in Pakistan. Amina is a dear friend and, of course, has done decades of work in promoting the publishing industry and especially in publishing fiction and academic non-fiction in Pakistan. So a big thank you to Amina for all her hard work and for making Betrayal kind of happen in Pakistan. So please do go buy the book. It is available everywhere in Pakistan through Lightstone Publishers, but also through all retailers. Please do go buy the book. And over to you now, Ms. Shahzad.
Actually, when you were talking about me, I had no idea who you were talking about because it was a woman I didn't recognize. But I'd like to begin by congratulating, first and foremost, Amina Sayyed for making Omar Shahid Hamid's latest book available to us. I think it's marvelous that we've got new publishers coming up with all the experience that she has garnered with OUP. I'm also delighted to be talking to someone like Omar. To me, he seems like a bit of an anomaly. He's not just a distinguished police officer and that Pakistan can be rightly proud of, but also comes armed with postgraduate degrees in criminal justice policy as well as law from prestigious institutions in London. He stuck that away under his shiny uniform belt. Umar, one would think that you had had enough of thrills in the field to last a lifetime. And one expected, if you wrote, that it would perhaps be a genre which is academic or something to do with legal policy or something like that. Why did you choose the thriller genre? You a glutton for punishment?
Well, first of all, it's fantastic and a real honor to be here with you. And I promised to be at my wittiest as I had, as we spoke before we started. And I think to answer your question, you're absolutely right. I made a mistake because now looking back on it, I think the genre that I should have gotten into was young adult romance, because that's where the money is. And this sort of fiction thriller police bit, theek hai, thoda bahut chalta hai, lekin I think the one that the one I missed was either I should have been writing about vampires falling in love with teenage girls, or sort of, high school romances. That's where the real money is. That's
where the moolah is.
That's what it is, yeah.
But no, seriously, Omar, when I read your book, and I have read The Prisoner, and this is my second reading of your work, this one, that's Betrayal that I'm talking about, it's an immensely clever book. But at the same time, it reveals a lot more about you as a person, as an officer, as a man, than The Prisoner did. Perhaps you honed your skills, and what I liked about it was the immediacy of the narrative. Because you write in the present perfect, the moment is right here and now. And yet I noticed in particular that it starts to veer a little bit towards the end. The had happened, the past continues to intrude. Is this consciously done? You wanted this rapid thrust of words being poured over the page, and for the reader himself to be overwhelmed by this barrage of words coming at him. You're the closest thing to a literary terrorist that I can look up. You really are.
Yes. Of course, if you look at The Prisoner and you look at Betrayal, it shows you an evolution that's happened now over 5 books and 13 odd years. And obviously I came, when I started writing The Prisoner, I had no literary background, no literary training or training in creative writing. So I sort of, did the best I could. But yes, the second reason for the immediacy for writing in that sort of present narrative is that I think that if you're writing a spy thriller, which this is, you need the action or the momentum of the story to be hitting you in the face constantly. At least that's my take. And so, writing it in this format suits that. It's something, that it's coming at you. It's almost like a 3D.
It's happening right now.
It's happening right then and there. It's a 3D construct where you feel almost as if you're part of you're inside the story.
But, when I started looking over your work, and I revisited The Prisoner and so on, which is loosely based on the Daniel Pearl case, here too, we find a lot of shades of what's happening right now in Pakistan. I mean, the ghost of Jadev haunts this particular book with the exchange of prisoners and so on. It's also, I don't know, it struck me reminiscent of Hanif's Exploding Mangoes, as well as his latest book, which is Red Birds, because when you talk about public figures, and very thinly veiled at that, and we'll talk about this a little later, because I loved your take on so many of the people who are in power right now. It's almost as though when you were writing this book, that you were prescient, that you knew what was going to happen, almost prophetic, as it were, because when we come to the conclusion of your book, this is exactly where we stand in Pakistan. And I'll read that little excerpt to everybody a little later. But first, to set the talk off, you said that you hadn't really thought about writing in this particular genre, but were there some writers who influenced you in some way, in some oblique, subconscious, subterranean way? There have to be, because there are so many elements in these books which have to do with mainstream thriller genre literature. And Yaqub called your book a novel. I'm not quite sure if it's a novel. because I'm not quite sure whether a thriller of this kind can be called a novel. But then I'm splitting hairs there. But tell me, was there any particular influence on you while you were writing? Another writer, thinker, some of your experiences within the field itself? What was it?
Certainly, when I started Betrayal, the concept, and if you look at almost all of my books, I often gain inspiration from events that have happened. Now, the books aren't necessarily a retelling of those events.
No.
They are, they're sort of fictionalized, and I take a lot of license with that. And it's the same with Betrayal. And what struck me was that, back in the sort of starting with the 60s, 70s, right up to the 80s, you had this big sort of genre of spy thrillers inspired by Cold War events, Dayton and Ricard and Forsyth and these sorts of people. And what we actually find, and obviously, they used their talents to very vividly create a picture of a moment in time, which was that very charged Cold War atmosphere between the US and the Soviet Union. And if you look at our context, what we have right now, really, for all intents and purposes, is a similar kind of regional Cold War type scenario with our
absolutely.
And we I haven't done extensive research on this, but whatever little I have come across from both sides of the border, from India and Pakistan, what we tend to do when we address these issues is go on a very jingoistic, narrow, nationalistic sort of streak. So, one side is good and one side has to be the devil. And that happens on both sides. And that doesn't, in my view, it doesn't lend to making good stories. And so the whole concept or the inspiration drawing upon writers like Likar and people like that was to create a very realistic sort of thriller, which touches on and is inspired by events, which kind of puts you in the room, right, where decisions are made, where these sorts of
the fly on the wall,
a fly on the wall, where all this subterfuge is going on.
Okay.
And also to show both sides when you have a situation like this, a Cold War type situation, which is primarily fought between intelligence agencies. You have professionals on both sides who are playing a game of chess, trying to outwit the other side.
Absolutely. That comes across very clearly in Betrayal, because it is really one move here and the rook and the queen being taken and so on and so forth. When I looked at the book, and forgive me if I'm being a little pedantic about it, but I was really impressed by the 5 narrative areas that you sort of insert into the book very cleverly. For example, the very intriguing anonymity of one section being called him, the other section being called her, and then telling the stories of Salim and Alina in those particular units. And then, of course, you move on to the mole hunter himself, who's a remarkable character that you created. I mean, look at his name, Constantine de Souza. I mean, Constantine from the Emperor Constantine, who established the Far Eastern Roman Empire, and the association that goes with being an Anglo-Indian in Pakistan. And you combine the two. I don't know if it was consciously done, because picking names for characters is really, it really needs a lot of thinking. Did you deliberately choose to make him a Christian? And why?
Yeah, Constantine is a character who I've recycled. He was a character whom I first introduced in my first book, The Prisoner.
Yeah.
And at that time, I thought that it was, to make him an Anglo, or rather to make him a Christian police officer working in Karachi at a time of great turmoil, was, in my view, a great plot twist. As a character, I thought he was the one, although, The Prisoner gets a lot of one of the other major characters, Akbar Khan, who's much more of an alpha male sort of character, gets a lot of attention.
Right. You make a reference to him in this book also.
That's right. But for me, the heart of that book, The Prisoner, was always Constantine. And I always I never wanted to waste him as a character. I wanted to kind of bring him back in some form or the other. And so I used this book to bring him back. And the same dynamic persists with him. So he's in this world where he's a part of the law enforcement or security establishment of the country. But he is
remains an outsider.
Yeah, exactly. So he is an insider, but he remains an outsider looking in because of his background, because of the uniqueness of it. And at times that is an asset, and at times it can be a hindrance. But he navigates things in that fashion. There's a point in Betrayal where he has to get into the UK, and
yes,
they tell him that, look, you've got to do it on your own. We can't sort of give you because you're not working.
The Church of England comes to the rescue.
Exactly. So there are times when those sorts of things work for him. But he is always, throughout his career, he's a man who kind of has to straddle these two worlds and straddle them very carefully, keeping in mind the kind of torrents that we have in our country. So he has to be very careful. He's naturally cautious, but that doesn't deter him from doing things.
Constantine is portly, he's balding, he's nothing like one would associate with the word hero. I don't know if there's something you want to say there for the Christian community without actually really slapping us in the face with it. Because in my reading of the book, apart from the fact that he doesn't have an air conditioner in his room and he's sweating it out and so on, because he's not one of the Shahid officers or whatever, he is still the cleverest in many ways. Because despite his faux pas about the Def Leppard conversation and him not being familiar with music at all, he's really the one who picks up on Alina to begin with, because nobody else has a clue. And Salim is this glorified, wonderful, heroic figure that everybody is very much in awe of. Yep. And he has this kind of charisma about him, which is very much, I think, reminiscent of Fleming and Graham Greene and characters coming from those kind of books. I certainly think he's very much a Bond-like figure. So attractive. Women can't resist him. And yet he's got he's very clear about his target. But it's a very sad book also. Did you notice that? Have you felt that? It's a sad book?
No, absolutely. And I won't say I intended it for that to happen, but it did. As I was writing it, it struck me that it, in many ways, becomes almost the love story in it, and the tragic love story in it, almost overtakes, or at least sort of has equal space as compared to the pure heart-pumping spy thriller. And I think that's I enjoyed writing that aspect of it, because it is about two people in love, and they're not young people. Usually when we write about love, it's
in their 40s.
People, they're in their 40s. They've sort of been through life. They have both had their own struggles in life. They knew each other, a lifetime ago. Somehow fate has thrown them back into the mix. And there is this kind of sad, the sadness is very much throughout a kind of what if we had not been thrown apart? What if we had been able to, create a life together? Call it regret.
I'd like to expand this a little bit, because I'm not just talking about love stories being tragic. This is almost a cliche. okay? Whether they actually have a future together or not, Alina and Celine. I mean, after she dies, obviously they don't, but I'm talking about the overall impact of the book itself. And I'd like to, with your permission, read a very small portion of what struck me as something very, this is what made me think that it was very sad, because, and this is the general talking, okay? It's towards the end. And he says, this system doesn't change from the inside. It has to be ripped apart. The government had to go. Hamdani wanted peace with India. What a stupid fucking idea. Did he ever bother to find out if they wanted peace? All the bleeding heart liberals who want peace never ask that question, do they? They cling to this fantasy that since we all have so much in common, we could all get along just as long as the big bad agency doesn't keep meddling. And then he used to say the same thing. You know, the one thing we do have in common across the border, Constantine, our politicians are all ruthless. They're governed by nothing except their naked self-interest. The more naked, the better. The one good thing this affair has done is to drive home the reality to our bleeding heart friends that the Indians are as bad as we are. We're all the same. This is a Cold War. There's no room for morality here. Now that for me was the saddest thing possible. Why? Because everybody loses. Everybody loses, except the general,
But that's
except the men in khaki.
That's also the heart of this sort of Cold War confrontation, right? That it is, in many ways you're sort of running around like a hamster on a wheel, and at times the people within that construct are so focused just on their immediate tactical victories that no one really sort of takes their foot off the pedal and says, you know, what's the wider significance of this? I mean, what are we getting from all this? So yeah, I totally agree with you that is the sad bit. And even I think when you talk about the agencies or the khakis, so to speak, they aren't really winners in it, because as the general,
I said everybody loses.
yeah, I mean,
everybody.
he also realizes that it's just, you know, this is the best that there's going to be, and you know, there's not that, which means that there's no resolution to things. There's no necessarily looking forward to a better future or a brighter future. It is what it is. You know, it's trench fighting. You're in the
things
trenches,
will never change.
and things, yeah. So there is absolutely that, and the general says that with the ingrained skepticism and cynicism of someone who has been at the heart of that security establishment for a very long time.
What about that skepticism and that cynicism being part of you as a person?
I think so. Perhaps not as skeptical as the general yet. Perhaps I need to be more senior to be as skeptical as that. But
why? Skepticism isn't confined to old age or maturity.
I mean,
getting very early in life.
You know, I think I used to consider myself an idealist, less so with time, with the passage of time.
Okay.
But yeah, you know, perhaps I will. The reason I say is that perhaps I am not at the level of General Shahram yet in terms of my skepticism, which is perhaps why I write books about it. You know, perhaps my characters portray a greater skepticism than I have. But I think going forward, it's a close run thing.
Okay. Now, when you talked about a tragic love story, you make a very fine distinction between love and loving in terms of Alina and your wife, Asma. So how
my wife, Sameer's wife.
Sorry, I You see how much I identify you with Samir. We're going to come to that because there's a lot of you in Samir and vice versa. Okay, so we haven't established that yet, but we're going to come to that. The point I'm trying to make is this is a very fine distinction. And I'd love for you to explain this further to us. What's the difference between love and loving? Because you do draw a distinction.
Yeah, I think it's, when we talk about Samir and Alina, I think in his mind, and perhaps in hers as well, they adhere to the sort of cliche, if you, for lack of a better word, that you only really fall in love once, and
Is that
everything
so?
else, well, it's
That's
their
your
version.
idealism
It's
coming
what
in.
they believe. It's certainly what he believes.
Okay.
That he, so she remains throughout his life the person that he truly loved, which doesn't mean that he didn't care for or didn't have loving feelings toward his wife, who tragically dies in the book. But there's only one person in his life whom he's met who has that same level of passion, whom he's been passionate about as compared to loving, and that's Alina.
But he has another passion. It's the vendetta.
Yes, that's the thing that consumes him, when even the last vestiges of normalcy or loving, as you put it, leave his life. He becomes, for the next 5 or 10 years, he becomes devoted to this vendetta, to his job. He marries the job, and her reintroduction into his life kind of brings back those feelings that have been repressed for a number of years, repressed first after they parted ways earlier in life, and then repressed even more after the death of his wife and children, or child. And so for a kind of middle-aged man who is very, very sort of focused, and again, he's at the heart of things, and he's this sort of, as you put it, Fleming-esque figure. This return to love, or the return of these feelings, which he hasn't really experienced since he was a young man or a teenager, or it's certainly in his early 20s, it's surprising to him. He doesn't know how to process it. This was never supposed to happen. He wasn't supposed to have met someone who could evoke those feelings in him, and certainly he never expected her to come back into his life. And that struggle on his part makes it interesting, I think.
You've called your book Betrayal, and there are many faces to this betrayal. It's not just the betrayal of love. It's also the betrayal of motherhood in terms of Zizou. It's men cheating on women. It's friend cheating on friend. Sajjad Ghani, for example, who
Absolutely.
turns 360 degrees round when he realizes that this is his moment to capitalize. With Salim being there, he could never have dreamt of becoming that powerful. And now that he's been removed, this is his moment. Then at the institutional level, I think that you constantly talk about this, though you don't say it in so many words, that the state betrays its citizens every single day. You also talk about establishment being betrayed by agencies. The men in Khaki betraying their connections with establishment as well as agencies because they have their own agenda. The spy master betrays the agent. Which is the most tragic betrayal of all? Is it on a personal level or is it on an institutional level?
I think the one that hits you and hit me while writing the book was the personal betrayals. But I think the one that impacts all of us, or impacts the story a lot more, is the institutional betrayals. It's it's coming back to that point about being skeptical or not skeptical, that there's a quote at the beginning of the book which says something like, in order to gain intelligence or in order to spy, you have to betray. So that is, if you say that you are a spy, by definition, you will have to betray someone or something, institution or personalities. And in creating this world, that's exactly, as you pointed out, what's going on, that there is no relationship, whether institutional or personal, that is not subject to betrayal. There is not, again, if you compare it with The Prisoner, there was always this friendship between Akbar Khan and Constantine. That was a friendship that, despite imprisonment and events or whatever, that friendship remains rock solid.
There's a level of camaraderie and affection between the two men.
Yeah. Whereas now, in this world, which is a little more higher up, it's a little more strategic, there are no such friendships. We think that the general and Samir Ali Khan are good friends.
No.
We think the Prime Minister and the National Security Advisor have a relationship that will survive all. It doesn't. Oftentimes when you are playing at that level, your relationships, your interpersonal relationships, are often destroyed at the first sight of any kind of strategic or tactical advantage that you think that you may need.
So it's really like building a country on a bed of sand. The foundations aren't there.
It is. It's if you sort of look at states like, look at Stalinist Russia, or where everyone was sort of an informer, where your children, where children informed on their parents and that sort of thing. Of course, that's an extreme. That's an extreme example.
We can't really compare that, because that was a revolution.
Yeah.
We haven't had a revolution.
No, we haven't, and obviously we haven't gotten to that extreme. But yeah, when you have this sort of situation of constant institutional betrayals and duplicity, yes, you do have an edifice that is standing on very shaky foundations. Yeah.
So it's something to worry about, isn't it?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, now I'm going to take you back to what you said in an interview in which, and I quote, "I joined the police because I felt the difference I could make was substantial." Now, I'm not meaning in any way to belittle or discount your undeniable counterterrorism heroism, but how have you made a difference? I mean, look at the relationship between the Pakistani police and the ordinary citizen. Harassed, victimized, beaten, not just in a physical sense, but in an emotional sense. I mean, the police is the last resort when you want to have something set right in your life as a citizen. I mean, people would much rather pay money to somebody else to fix their problem than go to the police. So how have you, in this wonderful, long, distinguished career, at a very young age, remarkable career, what's the difference you've made?
That, when I look at that quote, when I said it at the time, well, I still say it. When I say that you can make a difference, it was because of the things that you pointed out to, in fact, and the strength and the weakness of that statement both lie in the same facts, in the sense that because there is a lack of trust, because there is a lack of institutional foundation, again, the same point of having structures based on sand, what an individual can do matters a lot more. I always say that, for instance, what you can do as a police officer in Pakistan is perhaps, in terms of individually impacting people for good or bad, is a lot more than a police officer can do in London or New York, where the institutions are stronger. So it's
absolutely.
Absolutely. But the negative side of that is that where you have this very oscillating sort of graph of ups and downs, Unfortunately, it is very much personality based and individual based. So I may have thought that I have done plenty of very good things in various postings that I may have held. But if I were to go back to those places, even 6 months after I left them, that's the real question, whether those reforms, call them, or moves, or whatever good deeds lasted or not. That's the crux and the the sort of dilemma, that yes, as an individual you can make a lot of difference. You can be posted, let's say, in a certain district, and for the duration of your time there, people will, the feedback can be tremendous, and you can be a tremendous force for good, etc., etc. But then after you go, it's dependent on whoever replaces you, and whoever replaces you may choose to continue your path or may not.
But Omar, I agree with everything that you're saying, that one man can make a difference. I've always believed that myself. The point I'm trying to make is, why, if any good things have happened under a particular police officer's tenure, why aren't they reported? Because all we hear is these inane, ridiculous statements coming from really senior police officers. I mean, I don't have to tell you what has been happening recently, the motorway incident and so on and so forth. And particularly with reference to women and children. We've never had, or never felt, as a woman, I am appalled by the fact that women and the girl child are not safe in this country. Absolutely. So when you say, yes, a single man can make a difference, how? Where's the difference that's been made? I mean, even in your book, and I refer you to fact as well as fiction, there's nothing that the police officer has done which can be counted towards exemplary behavior or anything like that, or doing someone any good. All police officers do is get everybody else killed, including themselves, or having themselves dishonored, or having to live incognito, as in Salim's case, and so on. I mean, who comes out shining bright? Everybody's tainted. Your fiction supports the facts.
That depends a lot on the narrative. First of all, what I will say is that the police in any country is a reflection of that society. And, if we unfortunately are a society, which we clearly are, which is a particularly brutal society, especially when it comes to women and children, if the police is or does not appear to be as empathetic as it definitely should be,
as it
should be, that is definitely a reflection of that society. The other fact that you point to is this, that, as I said, the problem is that whoever may have come across, just speaking, let's say, of my 20 odd years on the job, if anyone did come across wherever in the country to promote a more positive image, he or she did not find that sustainable, right? So you may have had pockets, very small pockets, where people did try to do very positive things, but unfortunately the overwhelming narrative of that, or rather the overwhelming negative narrative, swamps that. It's something that I often mention, that when I wrote The Prisoner, as you read it, it's hardly a kind of propaganda piece for the police. It's a very truthful type of. It tries to reflect the realities of the situation.
Yeah.
One of the totally unintended consequences of it was that I received a lot of messages from people from all walks of life who said that it actually made them think very differently about the police, because they tended to think of them just as a kind of brutalistic sort of body. But
because that's their public persona.
And which is where my issue, my question of narratives comes out, right? I absolutely agree that the police has a lot to answer for. It does, and it should do a better job. as should we all as a society as well. But when it comes to narratives, we have been we haven't been bad at it. No one's done it, right? I mean, there's plenty wrong, for instance, with the police in countries like the US, with police shootings and those sorts of things. And yet, the narrative that you see in popular culture remains more or less, although that's changing, but more or less that narrative, whether it's in film, whether it's in books, whether it's in drama, remains a positive one. There's plenty of things wrong with, let's say, the police in India. But again, the narrative and the way it's shaped, there does seem to be a fair degree of positivity that is retained. And so that's why, I come back to the question of who shapes the narrative and whether a narrative has been shaped. You're right. I don't disagree with what you're saying. But I will say this, that over, a period of time, there have been plenty of heroic acts by policemen individually and collectively as well. It's just that we've not done a good job of marketing or selling it. Neither have the sort of powers that be, or neither has the department, nor has, for that matter, other elements of society. So the police is bad. It's reflective of the society we live in, and it's underreported in terms of its narrative. There is no narrative. I don't recall, if we just talk about fiction, I don't really recall reading a book about Pakistan, or a book that has to do with Pakistani fiction, in which you have a narrative other than, a sort of very typical thing of the traffic policeman taking money at from someone. So we haven't really, I think before The Prisoner, I don't really think we've had anything like that, and that remains the case today. So I think that is also part of the problem.
Did you get a rap on the knuckles after you wrote The Prisoner, and ever since you, apart from your cricketing book, from senior officers?
No, initially I thought I didn't get a rap on my knuckles because no one bothered to read. But as time went on,
oh yes, of course,
I found that actually plenty of people had read the book and quite appreciated it. So far, no rap on the knuckles. The knuckles remain pain-free so far.
Okay, now that we're talking about narratives, I'm very interested in the language and the scenario that you present on every page. It's very cinematic language, as I said, the here and the now, and it's very visual in that respect. The finest cinematic writer, who's also a great literary personality, is Graham Greene, 20th century. I mean, nobody gets bigger than him.
Right.
With two of your books being turned into films or television serials or whatever, what I've read, is it possible that somewhere along the way you were influenced by Graham Greene? Because he's really quite marvelous with dialogue as well as the visual aspect of his narrative.
I won't say I was influenced by him, but I'll say this. I think I've always been a very visual writer. So when I'm writing, I am kind of, I'm playing this scene in my mind, almost like a kind of shot. It's almost when I'm writing a scene of, let's say, the national security advisor talking to the prime minister in the prime minister's office. What I have going in my mind is, I'm thinking about, as you walk in, how does the military secretary open the door? What, whether the seats that they sit on are sort of leather couches or what sort of snacks.
As a media person, I noticed this very visual aspect of your work.
Yeah, I've always, I can't explain for the life of me why that is, but I've always been a very visual type of writer, which is why I think what the point that you refer to about my writing having a cinematic quality. I mean, again, I don't have any training or understanding of, for instance, if you were to tell me to turn any of these books into a script today, I wouldn't be able to do it. I would stare at you, dumbly because I wouldn't be able to figure it out. But yes, I will say that I do have this visual quality. or rather I think visually. And so
No,
that perhaps translates onto the page.
You really preempted my next question, which was, would you be willing to write for television or for the cinema? But you feel
I think I'd be horrible at it. But you are of course far more experienced at these things. I think I'd be horrible at it because I just don't have that training.
And you don't understand the medium as much?
Perhaps I don't understand the medium either. Absolutely.
But then you could work with somebody else who has the understanding.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you're because the story and the screenplay don't have to necessarily be done by the same person.
No,
So
no, absolutely.
There is that possibility.
Yeah. In fact, when we've been in talks recently about The Prisoner, and we've been sort of going through scripts, initial scripts of the breaking it up into an episodic sort of transition. I've been my job there has really been to see whether those scripts fit into the overall picture and mood of the
book itself.
Of the book, yeah. And whoever's doing the script writing, it's their job to sort of translate it into a script that is deliverable on screen.
Because I think if you were to do something like that, you would be doing a great service to the police force publicly and visually. Because there's nothing like television. It's in every house.
I agree. I absolutely agree.
If you present a narrative in which you have a positive picture, by all means be honest. But I'm sure there are honest police officers, and they never get talked about. They die in the line of duty. We have a single line saying so many policemen martyred, etc., and that's the end of that. So I think if they were allowed to be built up by visual narratives into actual people with homes and families and people who mourn them when they go and their own conditions, etc. I don't know if you remember, you're much too young, but perhaps you remember. There used to be a television series called Andhera Ujala.
Yeah. I'm not that young. Yes, I do remember.
Well, anyway, I'm a dinosaur, so I'm just looking at it that way. It was an absolutely wonderful series because it presented the policeman, both aspects of him, the honest one, as well as the one who was a little lax with his morals and so on and so forth. So perhaps something like that.
I agree. I totally agree. I think, as you said, I think Andhera Ujala for many people was there. Certainly for me, as a young boy, it was my first introduction to the police in Pakistan.
Okay.
And I think, as I said, it probably was the same for many people. And I totally agree that it humanized, and that's my point about narratives, that we have had these narratives about the police which have fundamentally dehumanized them. So when we talk about the police as a collective body of a mass, whenever we do so in the public discourse, and what we do really need is a sort of Andhera Ujala 2.0 for the 2020s to kind of bring those images and those perceptions up to date. And I have always said that it can't be a propaganda piece. Because I'm not talking about propaganda. It has to be an honest appraisal.
That's self-defeating.
Yeah,
when you become propagandist.
Yeah, and I think an honest appraisal is always one where I've always said that the police, as I said, firstly is always reflective of the society that they function in, and secondly that oftentimes they aren't heroes and they aren't villains. They're ordinary people whom at times respond to circumstances and situations in extraordinary ways. But at the heart of it is these ordinary people with, as you said, families and homes and domestic problems.
I honestly think that if you were to tackle this concept of the Thana culture, which is frightening for most people, I can tell you that if a woman walks into a Thana, it's a very traumatic experience. And I've had recent experiences, unfortunately, due to some problems that I had. I would not wish that on my worst enemy. I really would not, because
I agree.
there is an absolute lack of respect for man, woman, animal, whatever that walks in, because there is this misplaced concept of what authority is all about.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Yeah.
So anyway, I think I found your Achilles heel in your book, because with all this very muscular text that's going on at full speed and everything, suddenly there's a screech of brakes, and you talk about a distinct perfume. Aha, got you there.
There you go.
So even policemen have soft underbellies. Are you the only one, or are there other men like you?
No, I think I sort of, I'm sure there are other men like me, many like me, but it's funny because the perfume reference actually is from one of my favorite movies, which is Scent of a Woman. I don't know if you've seen it or not.
Yes. This is precisely what I was getting at, because it's the memory is more to do with how she smells rather than how she looks now and how she looked then.
Yeah.
So, and you say you've moved away from idealism. This is a stamp of radical idealism, as far as I'm concerned, if you can remember a woman by her scent. Anyway, getting back to what we were talking about, and I'm going to try and place you in a historical perspective. You know, there are ways, very specific ways in which a writer wants to be remembered, or he builds a legacy for himself. I'm going to refer you back to Graham Greene, because he clarified these points very clearly. He said he wrote thrillers, which he called entertainments. And then he wrote literary works like The Power and the Glory.
Right.
And he based his literary reputation on the latter. And it wasn't so much the thriller that he was talking about. So how do you see your legacy, or how do you want to be remembered? Because you're a prolific writer. I don't know, in the next 5 years, you might end up with 10 more books for all I know.
I like to think of myself as a storyteller. I've never quite understood, different genres and what makes one a more literary writer and what makes one a more sort of genre writer. And as I said, that probably has to do with the fact that I didn't come to writing from a more formalized structure. But I've always said that I think when I got into writing, it was again because I felt that there were these fantastic stories. At that time, there were stories, within the police that I thought just should be told by somebody. And I've maintained that storytelling personality in the sense that even when I wrote about match fixing in women's cricket, I thought the story of women's cricket on the one hand and the story of match fixing on the other hand were again two fantastic stories that were, that really
absolutely struck the national psyche in such a terrible way.
Yeah. So if I ever do have any legacy, I would like that to be as a storyteller, that he wrote good stories or captivating.
I'm sure you'll be remembered for that, definitely. Coming back to the present text, which is Betrayal, usually thrillers have a very clear picture of who the villain is. This is a book, oddly enough, it doesn't really have a villain.
No, it doesn't. And again, I think that goes back to that sort of classic Cold War genre where, if you look at things like Le Carré's Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy.
Yes, absolutely.
Carla is a villain, but he isn't, because there's plenty of things to admire about Carla as well. And so I think in my mind, the best pieces out of that genre were ones where you don't have a black and white Bond style villain, where you have an ambiguity, where both sides are, sort of doing their best to get one over the other, but there is not necessarily,
chess.
there's not necessarily a villainy that can be ascribed to that. That's just the
Don't-
job.
You don't have a distinct hero either. That's very interesting to me.
Yeah, again, because well, I suppose one could argue that Constantine is the one somewhat shining light, although he's not a completely shining light, but somewhat. But again, that is also, for me as a writer, the fun bit. When you do create these morally gray characters or flawed characters, it's much more fun to write
they're far
those.
more interesting than the black and
Absolutely.
whites.
Yeah,
absolutely. I agree with you. Why do all the women in your book get killed? I mean, the wife dies in a bomb blast. Alina dies horrifically in this horrible scene that I couldn't get out of my mind, trying to save her son that she had abandoned, dies trying to protect him. What is it? Is it some kind of misogyny at work?
No. It's interesting because when I was writing Betrayal, I think the first draft that I wrote had Alina surviving and Samir dying.
Why do you reverse it?
Well, when I read it, and in fact, I remember my wife, I gave it to her. She reads all my first drafts.
Excellent.
And she said, the view seemed to be that it didn't work as a story. If I did the reverse, it would work perhaps more as a story. And so when I kind of reversed it and had to look at it, it seemed to, as a story, it seemed to gel better.
Was it subconsciously a kind of punishment for her betrayal? Because she does betray him.
That's a very good question, and I think when I was doing it, the thing at the back of my mind was this, that will it be seen as she betrayed him? Because I never wanted her to be seen in this light as a betrayer. I mean, I think what she does, if a lot of us, is compulsion, and if a lot of us put ourselves in her position, perhaps we would very much do the same. Yeah.
Because she really didn't think it through, that how harmful it would be for Samir in the long run.
Yeah,
she really didn't have a perspective on how damaging it would be.
But her compulsions were too great, right? Perhaps she did, which makes it even more tragic, that perhaps she knew exactly how bad it would get for him, but there's nothing that she can do about it.
Omar, why on earth did you have that little exchange between the jihadi and the Israeli? And I thought that was completely unnecessary, that he starts shooting just because he says this is a Yehudi, and this conflict begins there, and the murder of so many people.
I think he's an interesting character, Zizou, because the rage is not necessarily because he sees an Israeli. The rage is at his mother. Right?
Of course it is.
Because it's this thing.
No, that comes across very clearly. That it's his resentment.
That is what kind of wells up, and the object, or the immediate object of that rage perhaps becomes the Israeli, but it's actually at the mother. This kind of, and I assume, or I would suppose, that that's a very understandable kind of rage at his part as well, right? This 21-year-old who's always been shown the door, and all of a sudden his mother wants to come into his life, and he's angry at that.
So it's his rage that gets everybody killed.
Yeah.
In a sense.
In a sense, yeah.
Okay. I'm going to quote Evelyn Waugh, and who writes that when you use words which are functional, devoid of sensuous attraction, of ancestry, or an independent life, you get the kind of narrative that you write. For you, is there no romance in the written word? Because actually, it's the way you write is, of course, it's very precise. It's very fast paced. It almost sort of overwhelms you as it comes. But the romance with the written word, you never thought of style or language, because these are the tools that you use. I'm looking at it more philosophically now as a writer, rather than as a content producer, as a storyteller, because it's so important. There are so many things that you actually remember. There's only one phrase from your entire book that I've sort of picked up, and I thought it was such a wonderful line, whether peace in our time is possible. And the general has this line, and it's very ironic that it should come from him. Is peace possible in our time? That to me is really, in that sense, the only phrase that one can take away from this book, apart from the emotional impact of the characters and so on and so forth. And of course, I admire the way in which you've mingled this whole culture of the Bowen identity with Bond and with Smiley's people and all this, and just made it so indigenous and so believable in our particular context. I mean, it's really admirable what you've done with it. But was there any particular character that you were fond of, that you would have liked? Apart from D'Souza, I know you're fond of him. Did you have sympathy for any? You know, there are characters who run away with you. Was there any?
To answer, I have sympathy for all of them. Because when I write them, I do, with the example that we just discussed about Zizou as well, I try and put myself in the shoes of every character. Even the ones that maybe, and perhaps that's the reason why there aren't any outright villains, because I try and make them as, I try and empathize with them, or try and at least see things from their point of view. So I certainly have sympathies with all of them. As you said,
any particular character that you are really fond of?
Alina.
Why?
I think she's a tough woman. She's been hurt in life.
And she's had a tough life.
She's had a tough life, but she keeps getting up and she keeps sort of fighting her way. I mean, the fact that she is, people say, and in fact, there's some questions over here in the box as well about me writing weak women characters, and that's something that I disagree with in the sense that, when I wrote my first 3 books, those books were based in a very, very, in the world of sort of the police and political parties and all in Karachi, and that is a very chauvinistic sort of world. And so at that time, perhaps women characters didn't really come into it, but with both Betrayal and with The Fix, which is all about women, I thought that the characters were much stronger, and they are sort of strong-headed women who,
there's always been a huge debate about whether men can successfully write about women and vice versa, whether women authors can write successfully about men. It depends on the final verdict comes through if your character is credible.
Yeah.
And therein lies the success of the writer.
Yeah. Which is why I think that she's, she's very, to use a term I like to use, very ballsy. She's got a lot, she may not look at first glance to be sort of real tough cookie, but she's someone who hunts down her rapist in ways that very few of us would be able to do. She's someone who's not afraid, and even in the end, she's someone who shows that she's not afraid to take a very, very tough decision.
And she nurses that vendetta for 9 years.
Absolutely, yeah.
So there I agree with you. She's a very strong character.
Yeah.
I may not particularly like her for a certain number of, but that's absolutely personal. Now, talking about things being personal, loss is a very small word, but it carries so many ramifications and such enormous, scars it carries with you. Salim pursues his career with a clear agenda. There's the obviously the vendetta against the terrorists who killed his wife and young daughter. I was wondering if somehow subconsciously, in a subterranean way, some shades of an autobiography slip into Salim's character through your own experience as a young man losing your father under horrible circumstances, and just sort of slip through the cracks in a way. In other words, what I'm asking you is, has it been possible to come to terms with your father's assassination? Is it ever possible?
I'll answer your first question about the character. I find this is a question I'm often asked, and
Yeah.
I find it very difficult to write any character based on myself in any of my books. And there's been this sort of guessing game a number of times when The Prisoner came out, when The Party Worker came out. I would find it very difficult, perhaps because I'm a shy person, to expose parts of my personality onto the written page. And so I create characters. Incidentally, they may have bits and pieces of their origin stories that may be similar to mine, but I don't think, I think the characters that I create, whether it's Sameer or others, are far more interesting than I am. To your point about coming to terms, coming to terms with death is on its own a very difficult thing. Coming to terms with violent death, ramps up the difficulty level of that. But two things there. One is, of course, time. If it doesn't heal all wounds, it certainly puts a balm on them. And the other is that there
at
is
least it distances you from that.
It distances you from it, and I think there is some sort of, I would say, catharsis. I'll say this, that I think if a combination of the two, of being a writer and being a police officer, perhaps if I had not stumbled upon this kind of unique combination of skills, I would perhaps be at a greater loss or be more lost in life than I am now. Let's put it that way. I think both of these, being in both of these jobs, helps me to process things, to process personal tragedy in different ways and in much more efficient ways.
So in a sense, it's been cathartic, this
Absolutely.
union,
Absolutely.
this union of the literary aspect of your personality,
Absolutely.
as well as being a great field officer.
Yeah.
Now,
absolutely.
What makes a man laugh, or for that matter, a woman laugh, says a great deal about them. Or for that matter, how an author describes lovemaking says a great deal about them. Your humor in particular, I found very droll, and immediately drew references to Hanif, because it's got the same kind of tongue-in-cheek kind of schoolboy prankish feel to it. For example, calling Anwar Tareem Malik ATM, the ATM machine where you draw money from, and he's a money-making machine himself. And for that matter, the the waste management company that you have called. I just couldn't get over laughing that the TUL, I'm not going to repeat what the acronym stands for, the wonderful, ingenious confusion between Def Leppard, the music band, and Def Leppard, the mole, that actually got all the action off the ground. I thought that was absolutely wonderful, as well as the Wi-Fi password on the official plane, which is really fantastic. How would you describe yourself? I thought the lovemaking descriptions and scenes, etc., were pretty standard. Plus the fact that the partner gets killed off. So it's very, very much Mr. Bond. But how would you describe yourself? Unconditionally kind, cruelly self-assured, because that's the way these men are. Caring but distant. Which of Salim's characteristics would you own up to?
Cruelly self-assured and at a total loss at the same time.
So the vulnerability comes in along with this sense of purpose. You make him vulnerable at the same time?
Yeah.
Are you like that yourself?
Yeah, I think so. I'm pretty vulnerable.
Yeah. Mixture of the two?
Yeah.
Well, that's how a good man should be. I think that none of your characters, and perhaps this is deliberate, because it can't be otherwise, none of your characters suffer struggle of the soul, as it were. I mean, Alina's anguish at having abandoned her child is a different scenario altogether. But talking about salvation and damnation and the metaphysical realities of good, evil, sin, divine grace, none of the characters are concerned with that. How do you see your own work in ethical terms?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, all of and in fact, again, not just in this book, but I think really across my books, none of my characters could be mistaken for being particularly spiritual. They're all hard personalities, people who are very much rooted in what we call the quote unquote real world. And deal with.
But the real world is resurrecting itself in terms of spirituality. I mean, look at all the meditation that's going on, and the going back to yoga, and the going back to nature, and so on. It may be a different kind of spirituality without the divine element in it as such, but it is a harking back. It is a reaching out.
It is, but I think these people have always had the sort of belief that they are in positions to change the nature of things. And so they are men who, for lack of a better phrase, like to play God. All of them. I think Samir does that. The general certainly does that.
Well, D'Souza says that he doesn't want to play God.
Yeah, but he keeps in both The Prisoner and in this, he keeps denying that he doesn't want to play God, and yet he finds himself in these situations where he does. So they're all people who are kind of well versed in the exercise of willpower. And the spiritual doesn't occur to them, or if the spiritual is there, it's only there to serve their purposes rather than for them to serve it in some way.
The ancient Greeks had a wonderful formula for what we now call the conscience. They had this divine rule and the negative demon, because more often than not, your conscience tells you what not to do rather than what to do. Your characters are pretty much conscience-less people, and that is very disturbing for me.
And in
because the manner in which Salim is thrown off completely, because he's got himself into this hole that he can't dig himself out of. And that wonderful telephone conversation over 1.5 page, in which very cleverly he's sort of sidelined completely, and all the onus of what has gone wrong, etc., is palmed off onto him while D'Souza is listening. I found that very disturbing. Is this what Pakistani society is all about? Because everything you write is a reflection of the kind of people we are. Is there no tenderness among us? Is there no joy among us? No lasting joy? I mean,
as you said that, I think the title for the sequel to Betrayal just popped in my head, which is, I think, calling it the next one, The Negative Demon, is going to be a fantastic book.
Well, I shall charge you copyright for that.
Absolutely. It is, we talked about this earlier as well. We have become, unfortunately, a very brutal society. We are a society where we kind of throw off people or institutions which no longer suit us very quickly. Yeah, so and the characters in Betrayal do reflect that, and they reflect it because obviously they're these people at the highest who are sort of playing the highest stakes game in some of the highest offices of the land. And so their ability to think that everything is disposable is very much there. And yes, unfortunate as it is, I would have to say that is a trait that we have developed in the society that we've created as well. Wouldn't you say that?
I agree with you. And I'm greatly saddened by it, because I belong to a far more innocent world. I really do. And it's unfortunate that we haven't passed on that kind of a world to our younger people. But at this point, I have to stop monopolizing you, because we've got a host of questions that your listeners want to address to you. It's been wonderful talking to you, Omar. And just go ahead and talk to
It has been an absolute pleasure, and you will absolutely get the naming rights for The Negative Demon. To answer a number of the questions, so we've got one here that says, would it have been different if Constantine had been a Pakistani Christian rather than an Anglo-Indian? He's an Anglo in the sense that he's sort of Karachi Goan rather than Punjabi Christian, which is the other sort of large denomination that we have. And the experience of the sort of Goan Christian community based in Karachi is a little different to the sort of Punjabi Christians, especially those who live in Punjab. I don't know if it would have been different, but for me, because Constantine emerged out of this thing of being a cop in Karachi, that identity was the one that made more sense. So that's why he's Goan Christian rather than sort of as the questioner put terms with Pakistani Christian. The other question is, being a civil servant, is fiction a way to take out frustration in the system? No, but it is. When I did start writing, it was a form of catharsis, as we discussed. At the time that I started writing The Prisoner, it was a particularly bleak time in my career. And it did start as that. And now I think it's my sort of ventilator or my oxygen, in the sense that I need it to just keep functioning. So not quite a way to take out frustration, but certainly to modulate any frustrations. Is the Cold War of Betrayal still going on in Pakistan today? Yeah, we address that we definitely are in a very sort of Cold War type scenario with our neighbors. And that's definitely there. The next question is, have you ever thought of writing in Urdu? I have written in Urdu. Unfortunately, the things that I've written are non-fiction and usually called FIRs. So, no fun there. My talents in writing Urdu, I think, do not exceed the half-page, what we call mazmoon that has to be there in an FIR. So I really would be stretching it if I tried to write a novel in Urdu. But I think there has been a lot of talk, and I think that it would be very interesting to see some of my books in translated in Urdu, because that just brings an entirely different audience, an entirely different point of view. And I know that we are working on The Prisoner, and I'm sort of waiting with bated breath as to how the Urdu translation of The Prisoner, how it's perceived and how it comes across. So, perhaps something there in the future. Has fiction ever helped you in your normal police work? It's interesting. Since I started writing, I find that as a police officer, I've become more observant of the minutiae of situations. So yes, I would say that it has strangely helped me in my police work. And lastly, the question coming back on women characters, maybe your women characters are influenced by the current state of our society and our attitudes toward women. Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, perhaps Navid would be able to express a better opinion about Betrayal, but certainly the book of mine that has the most female characters, which is the book about match fixing, absolutely is based. I think the way that people interact with those characters is reflective of our attitudes towards women in society. Would you say, Navid, that Alina is also reflective of that, or is she a little different?
Yes and no. It's a particular class of woman that we're talking about. And when you look at the majority of women in Pakistan, they couldn't even dream of the kind of life that Alina has had.
Absolutely, yeah.
So we're talking about a very marginalized group of women, and trying to impose our attitude about that particular group onto the entire majority, I think would be very unfair.
Yeah. That's an absolutely fair point, that Alina is someone who, she flies around in sort of private planes and stuff, and not even the 1%.
Jimmy Choo shoes and her fashion empire and so on and so forth.
And hiring Israeli mercenaries and all that.
Yeah.
Sort of
How many women get to do all that? It's a very, very small margin. I think we've got Amina online. Would you like to say the last word?
I think we can't hear you, Amina. You're muted.
Yeah.
Thank you. A big thank you to my dear friend, Navid Shahzad, Nivi, and to Omar, Shahid, Hamid, and of course to Yaqub Bangash for this program. I think it's been absolutely riveting. I've really enjoyed it. I hope that everyone watching it has has also enjoyed it equally. And I'm, as a publisher of Omar's book, Lightstone Publishers, I'm delighted to say that it's been a runaway bestseller, the book. There was a rush at the bookshop when the book first came. And already we are now reprinting the second impression, I think within a month, because it's been almost sold out. And I think, as Omar said, that, he would like to be remembered as a storyteller. And what a storyteller. I mean, this book, when Omar sent me the manuscript and I was reading it, I was up all night because I just could not, and I forgot that I was reading a manuscript. I was just so engrossed in the book. So thank you, everyone. And thank you, Yaqub and Omar and Nivi and Thinkfest for organizing this. This is actually the first time that we are having this kind of an event for Omar's book in Pakistan, because I think you're in the US, and inshallah, when you come back, then we are going to plan other events. Thank you, everyone, and Khuda Hafiz.
Thank you, Naveed, and thank you, Yaqub. It was a fantastic talk.
I really loved having a shot at you, but it was great fun. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Really
thank you.